Today, we'll be speaking with Dr. James Gross from Stanford University on emotion regulation. Dr. James Gross is a professor of psychology at Stanford University. He received his BA in philosophy and psychology from Yale University and PhD in clinical psychology from UC Berkeley, with subsequent postdoctoral training at the UC San Francisco. Dr. Gross is widely regarded as the pioneer in the field of emotion regulation, and his work has received numerous awards, including Early Career Awards from the Society for Psychophysiological Research, an Early Career Award from the American Psychological Association, Outstanding Young Researcher Award from the Western Psychological Association, and countless teaching awards, such as an award for teaching excellence at Stanford University, such as the Walter J. Goris Award for Excellence in Teaching, the Bass University Fellow in Undergraduate Education, and a postdoctoral mentoring award from Stanford University. His work has been supported by numerous grants from the NIMH, NSF, the NIDA, among others. He's also published over 200 papers and edited the authoritative handbook of emotion regulation. So I now turn to our experts in emotion interview with Dr. James Gross. So welcome, James. Thank you for speaking with us today.
My pleasure.
I wanted to begin with talking with you about how you first got started in studying emotion. So could you tell us a bit about what first sparked your interest in emotion?
June, that's a great question. I've been interested in emotion for as long as I can remember. Academically, the source of my interest comes from longstanding interest in philosophy, where at least in the Western tradition, there's this rich history of questions around the role of reason versus passions in guiding behavior. And as I wrote philosophy paper after philosophy paper at Yale as an undergraduate, I found that the core of my interests really revolved around problems about when reason should be in control and when passions, including emotions, should be in control. And that's what laid the foundation for my work in psychology, trying to understand empirically how to balance the two.
Oh, that's fascinating. So you had this philosophical interest in the nature of emotion that you're later able to tackle with empirical tools.
Exactly right.
So speaking of empirical tools, actually, I have a few questions I'd like to ask you about your research.
Great.
So we can all relate to emotion in our everyday lives, but it seems like defining things like emotion and emotion regulation are really a thorny and tricky issue. So as an expert in this field, I was curious to hear how you think about defining what emotion is and how it's different from emotion regulation.
It's a great question. In everyday life, I think there's a very strong sense in which we make a distinction between the emotions we have and the things we do to manage or change those emotions. And so in our work, we find it useful to map onto that intuitive or lay distinction. And what we have in mind is something, I think, fairly straightforward. In many circumstances, an emotion might we might start feeling angry with a spouse or a child. And as that anger unfolds, coloring our thinking, our facial behavior, our physiologic responses, as we become aware of that anger, we may feel that that's not the right response, that's not a helpful response in this circumstance. And so try to modify or change how that anger is playing out. We may try not to show it or may even try not to feel it. And it's that lay distinction between the emotion on the one hand and efforts to modify or change it that we're trying to map onto when we make a distinction between emotion reactions on the one hand and emotion regulation on the other. Another context for this distinction that's important to us is how it plays out between people, because emotions aren't just things that happen inside a person, but also things that happen very importantly between people. So for example, with a child or a spouse or a parent, the other person may be in an emotional state, let's say, of sadness, where, let's take the case of a child, someone is very, very disappointed and upset at something that's happened at school. And it's often the case, particularly for young children, they don't have the skills yet to manage or modify their own emotions. And so they may come to a parent or older sibling for help in regulating emotions. And in that case, too, I think it makes sense to try to distinguish between the emotions that are playing out in the child and the regulatory processes that are invoked in this case by a helping other. And so I think what's important, June, in thinking about this debate about whether it makes sense to distinguish between emotion reactions on the one hand and emotion regulation on the other is to ask for what purpose, local purpose, are we making this distinction? And I think part of the confusion in the literature is that some people looking at this distinction say, well, that's not a distinction about real things in the world. That is to say, you can't guarantee with necessary and sufficient conditions, you can always distinguish between an emotion generative process and an emotion regulatory process. And my response to that is that I take more of a instrumental perspective and think that this kind of distinction isn't so much about defining natural kinds in the world as it is about creating contexts in which we can ask and answer empirical questions that matter to us. And so this is a distinction of convenience. And I think in some cases, it's easy to draw the line between emotion generation and regulation, as in the cases I've given. But in other cases, it becomes more blurry. And that, I feel, from an instrumental perspective, is not a problem, because in those cases, we might not want to make such a tight distinction between the two.
Mm-hmm. That's great, and it relates to what I was going to ask you more about, which is you really laid out this roadmap or process model of emotion regulation that really has shaped the way we all think about not only when emotion regulation strategies occur, but what specific kinds of strategies or ways we use to manage our emotions. And I was wondering, when you think about sort of the future of where emotion regulation is headed, do you see this model changing or growing over time, and in what ways?
June, the process model of emotion regulation is meant to be a framework within which we all can think about how emotions play out over time and how they can then be modified either by ourselves or by other people. And I emphasize it's a framework rather than a well-developed model. And the distinction for me rests on the idea that this is just an initial sort of draft of a workspace that will absolutely evolve as we fill in with more understanding and more knowledge. And so for me, the framework really rests on a couple very basic assumptions: that emotions develop over time, they change over time in a context-sensitive fashion. They may vary dramatically across contexts and across people, but that as we see emotions play out in ourselves and in others, we can usefully draw attention to the ways that we and others may try to change that emotion trajectory. And as you say, I've tried to distinguish among 5 families of regulatory processes, ranging from very early efforts to intervene to change the emotion that's playing out to much later interventions. And I think there's going to be lots of change in that space. I think it's a very generous space that really rests on these very basic assumptions that I think there's every reason to think will have utility as we move forward. But there are loads of other questions, I think, that this kind of model requires that we ask. For example, we need to ask questions about how people actually are trying to modify their own emotions and others' emotions. And we are only beginning to understand how people go about regulating their emotions. Not just what they do, but what their emotion regulation goals are. I think from a lay perspective, you might think it's easy. People try to turn down bad emotions and turn up good emotions. But what does that mean? It's certainly not as simple as always trying to do away with negative emotions, ones that feel yucky, or increase emotions that feel good. There are many instances, as you know very well from your work, where we want to turn down positive emotions and perhaps turn up negative emotions. So that's an example of the way that I think this framework will need to grow as people do more work on the processes involved in emotion regulation.
Yeah, thank you. And as you think of this sort of process model or framework emerging and growing, do you see any certain types of influential tools or methodologies that are going to be most critical in these next steps?
You know, I think there's going to be a mix of advances that are going to be really important in this space. Some of these are going to be theoretical as we really try to better understand the larger context within which people are regulating their emotions. I've said that in my own work, we focused on trying to draw some distinctions among processes that people use to modify the emotion trajectory. But I've said that we need to broaden our view to understand not just what people are trying to do, but why they're trying to do it. And I think we can learn quite a bit from other related research efforts to understand motivated behavior more generally and goal-directed behavior more generally, asking in this case, as in other cases, not just what people are doing and why they're doing it, but how this plays in with all of the other many goals that we have as we move through life. And so part of the, I think, effort will need to be theoretical. So conceptual advances in our thinking, borrowing as we can from other theoretical traditions. I think another important growth point for us will be not just theoretical, but empirical. And here we're working in a really exciting time where there, as you know very well, a range of new tools, more sophisticated approaches to behavior analysis, more sophisticated approaches to tracking people's subjective experience as it evolves over time, but also neurobiological assessment tools, functional imaging techniques, as well as procedures for better understanding people with various types of brain damage, and in healthy individuals, better understanding the role of particular brain systems through inactivation procedures, such as TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. So I think there's a range of tools, both conceptual and empirical, that will be brought to bear to help us better understand how people manage their emotions as they unfold.
And I know in your more recent work, you've driven it in a direction that's really interesting, sort of relating emotion regulation to clinical health outcomes, and in particular focusing on social anxiety disorder. What have you found when you think about and research social anxiety disorder? How do you characterize the nature of emotion regulation and the ways it may be going awry?
June, one of the strategies that we and others have used is to try to understand emotion regulation processes by looking at clinical contexts, such as social anxiety disorder. And one of the surprises, I think, for us, as has been the case for other people who've used affective science approaches to better understand clinical phenomena, is that everything isn't exactly as we had expected it might be. And I think that really is a testament to the value of applying affective science measures and conceptual sort of rubrics to these complex clinical phenomena. For example, just give you a quick example. In social anxiety disorder, people are often quite impaired, unable to interact with others socially, unable to work as they'd like to outside the home. And this can be a really debilitating disorder. And the core of the disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is heightened levels of anxiety. And that led us to the straightforward assumption that when we carefully assessed people in the laboratory using functional imaging, that we'd be able to easily distinguish between the emotional responses of people with social anxiety disorder on the one hand and healthy matched controls on the other. In terms of the magnitude of the emotional response in some of these brain systems, such as the amygdala and insula, that are thought to be important to emotion generation. To our surprise, what we're finding in these laboratory contexts is that when we build relevant, socially rich stimuli, and we show these to participants who are either characterized as having social anxiety or are matched controls who don't have the disorder, we see robust responses, physiologic responses in both groups that are often indistinguishable. Now, that's not to say that subjectively people with social anxiety aren't suffering and reporting very high levels of anxiety, but when you look at some of the core brain systems that are thought to subserve emotional responding, we see often no differences in these brain systems response in these contexts. And this is in context after context. And what that tells me is that our conceptions of emotion reactivity as being simply greater in social anxiety across the board as compared to healthy controls are too simple, that there's a response fractionation such that subjectively, and certainly there are parts of the brain other than these core brain systems that are thought to be important to emotion generation, that must reflect this difference. But that the simple assumption that there's obvious and gigantic reactivity differences is too simple, misses the mark. I think another surprise for us is that related to the notion that people with social anxiety have much greater reactivity is the idea that they cannot use appropriate regulation strategies. That the reason that they have greater reactivity is that they simply can't use healthy strategies like reappraisal, which involves thinking differently about upsetting situations. And what we found in our laboratory studies is that when appropriately cued and instructed, people with social anxiety disorder are just about as good at using reappraisal as healthy controls. And that now, again, is a bit of a surprise and suggests that not that there's nothing to learn here, but that we've been focused in the wrong place. Rather than assuming greater reactivity, rather than assuming failures across the board in regulation, what we think is happening is that people are unable, when not cued, so in the real world, they're unable to, if they have social anxiety, appropriately invoke skills that they actually have. And that then points, I think, to a great mystery, which is why aren't they using the skills they have? And that would be an example of the kind of thing we're learning in this work.
Yeah, and when we think about this work, beyond social anxiety disorder, it sounds like there's lessons we could apply to a host of different disorders, depression, bipolar disorder, etc. Do you feel like there's big picture lessons to take away about emotion regulation and psychopathology?
Absolutely, June. I think that the work that we and others are doing on specific disorders such as social anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, all of these research programs, I think, are only partly about the specific disorders. And I'm actually much more interested in the general lessons, which I think are many, that we really need to be careful with our assumptions, that clinical traditions and even diagnostic criteria may not be richly informative about underlying mechanisms, that when we come to the table with an assumption about greater reactivity in one case, diminished reactivity in another, we need to be open to the possibility that when we use multiple assessment approaches, we'll see fractionation so that there'll be greater reactivity with some measures and not with others. I think on the regulation side, we need to be open to the possibility that the simple starting point of failed regulation, they can't regulate, needs to be unpacked. And the reason that's so important to draw these general lessons, I think, is that if we want successful intervention strategies, the more sophisticated we can be about what's wrong, the more likely we are to be able to help people make it right.
Thank you. So it's been great talking to you about, your thoughts on how we tease apart emotion from emotion regulation, how we think about the future of emotion regulation and where it's headed, and now linking it to some clinical health outcomes. And so all of that's been interesting. And when you think now sort of more broadly about the future of emotion, where do you see the sort of field headed?
I think the larger field, we've talked in this conversation about the many exciting growth points as I see them for emotion regulation. I think, as I've said, there's room for theoretical advance here. There's room for empirical advances, applications to clinical contexts, and many other exciting, I think, avenues for inquiry, even in the narrower domain of emotion regulation. Some of our work, for example, we're extending, and this is with Eran Halperin in Israel, looking at intractable conflict and how emotion regulation perspectives might actually make a difference in these longstanding intractable conflicts. So I think even moving beyond individual level psychopathology and distress to much larger societal ills, whether in intractable conflicts or in the classroom, I think there's lots of exciting work to be done, even in the narrower area of emotion regulation. I think if we broaden our view and think very generally about the field of emotion and even more broadly to affective science, there's an incredible amount of exciting opportunities for researchers and students coming into the field today. I think at play are basic questions about how to conceptualize emotions, whether they're things in the world that we're just describing, or whether they're things that are psychologically constructed and therefore, amenable to various interventions. I think we need to relate emotions, however they're conceptualized, to other affective processes like moods. All of this is basic work that still needs to be done. I think because we have new tools, conceptual and empirical tools, we're going to be, I think, learning an immense amount about how emotions play out, not just in the laboratory, but in the real world where they matter, how they play out in social contexts, how they play out over the course of development. And I think there's, in each of these sub areas of psychology, whatever one's starting point, a very rich set of questions about the nature of emotion and other affective processes. My particular focus, of course, is how they can be modified and changed over time. But I think that's just a tiny fraction of the exciting sort of opportunities in this larger space of affective science.
So if you were talking to students, you mentioned students, in sort of the future they are going to be building in learning about emotion and emotion regulation. What kind of advice would you have to these students or people in general who want to learn more about emotion? Where should they go?
Yeah, so I'm, as you can hear, very bullish about the future of affective science. I think I'm happy to be in the field, and if I were advising students, I would say, hey, there's great opportunity here. There are just a very large number of problems to tackle that matter. And I would recommend that they take a good look at the field and the ways that, whatever their starting point, they can link affective processes to their own interests. Again, whether it's developmental or clinical, or from a health psychology perspective, lifespan developmental, biological, cognitive, any of the areas of the field, however you define them, I think, are richly connected to these affective processes. So I would say this is where a lot of action is going to be happening over the next decade or two and longer. I would say please take a good look at the field. In terms of how to get started, I think the series that you're building is a really exciting tool. I think they're increasing opportunities for students at different universities in different contexts. As I tell my students, when I teach Psychology 1, if they want to jump in and really see what psychological science in this space is like, they should join a research lab, whether it's for a summer or whether it's for a longer period of time, to really get involved in the science that's being done. I think that's the way to really get a feel beyond reading papers and books, which is an obvious starting point.
Well, it sounds like it's an exciting time for the future of emotion. So I just want to thank you, James, for speaking with us today. It's been a real pleasure.
My pleasure, June. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. So this concludes our Expert in Emotion interview with Dr. James Gross from Stanford University.